So anyway, back to you.
Yeah.
See, we've got the handsome farm boy from Tyrone, and he goes and does these PhDs and looks at the country house, and then he ends up the vulgar reality of having to get a job,
Yeah.
and you end up, lo and behold, in Mount Stewart
Yes.
as a curator. Is that
Yes,
right?
well, technically, collections and house manager, which is the trust term, but a lot of sort of a mixture of conservation and curation. So there was lots of exciting things to do, like cataloguing objects and researching the history and writing articles and doing tours and laying on exhibitions and all that kind of stuff, as well as caring for the collection. But I think the two go hand in glove. I think.
So is that like your dream job?
Yeah, it was at the time, and actually, I remember I'd visited Mount Stewart as a child, with my parents as a tripper, loads of times, and then I went back with a friend, and interestingly, we were walking back to the car after a day out at Mount Stewart, and he said, "If you could stay here forever and never leave, would you?" And I was so enchanted by Mount Stewart at that point that I said, "Oh my gosh, why would you not want to stay here forever? Of course, if you got the chance to be here forever, why would you not? Why would you not? If you didn't have to leave with all the public at the end of the day, why would you? And then lo and behold, that came true, and I got the job, which I probably was, severely underqualified for at that time, but my then manager saw a spark, and obviously, Lady Rose's family still live in the house, so
that's what the National Trust called the historic family.
The historic
Great
family.
concept, that is.
Yeah, which they're so important, and so in a sense, it was very important that whoever would take on that job, because you present the house, you lay out the contents, you have a hand in the curation of the rooms, what stories you tell, all that kind of stuff, that you're sort of able to work with the historic family to tell, I suppose, what they feel is a true representation of what their family were trying to do at various times in history.
So did you feel a big responsibility that you're carrying a torch of, because it's a big community role actually presenting Mount Stewart, isn't it?
It is, and I think the main thing is that Mount Stewart, it's it's so complex, and the history of Mount Stewart is so complex, and every generation has left an incredibly complex layer. So it's a really, it almost, every layer or every sort of generation of family have almost kind of mythologized themselves and their legacy, and almost curated it to a certain degree themselves, that you almost kind of, invariably with Mount Stewart, it's so colourful and so complex that it's very difficult to talk about it in very black and white terms, or very factual terms. I think whenever I worked for the trust, there was obviously a very strong feeling that all history that should be represented for the public or produced for the public should be robustly researched and should be very kind of sort of objective, and that's incredibly difficult.
If not impossible.
If not impossible, because the personalities that we're working with are so strong, and they're almost like, I would say with Edith Londonderry, for example, there are so many Ediths. Which one do you pick? There was Edith, the military leader. There was Edith, the horticulturalist. There was Edith, society's queen. There was Edith, the simple gardener. There was Edith, the interior designer. There was Edith, the lover of all things Celtic, Gaelic, be it music, literature. There was Edith, the mother. There was Edith, the grandmother.
Edith the diplomat.
Edith the diplomat. Edith, a political hostess. Edith the traveller. Edith the collector. And so I suppose actually in the role of kind of curator, conservator, that sort of thing, if you don't throw yourself into the spirit of the place and the kind of soul of the place and what she was trying to do and what all the previous Lady Londonderrys were trying to do, it's impossible to grasp Mount Stuart, and it's impossible to grasp Mount Stuart's importance. And it's, people have said, much more qualified people than me, have said that Mount Stuart is one of the most, in many ways, impressive country houses in the British Isles, and certainly was, albeit it was their smallest home at one point, and yet this small cabin by the sea, as somebody once called it in the 18th century, has always carried such political importance.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, I don't know how it was for you, but to me, it's very contested space because, of the troubles and so on, how you approach it, how you understand it is so contested, because you're aware of it's Londonderry,
Yeah, but I think that's actually something, there's sort of two day-to-day contentious things that I came across, and that was the fact that they made their money out of coal. So I often had lots of people from the north of England going, this is disgusting.
And the miners struck and so forth. And
yeah, and you sort of go, well, actually, I don't know how I, counter that. Your feelings are perfectly valid. And, I had, the Londonderrys, they still have their family diamonds, which came from the first Mrs. Stuart, so again, this lovely female connection.
Who's that, Frances Anne?
No, it was actually a lady called Mary Cowan from Donegal.
Oh, her, oh, right,
yeah. Well, so Mary Cowan from Donegal, well, she was actually from Derry, so she lived...
All the best,
but she lived in Derry, so she was a Derry girl, and in 1737, she married her cousin. He was from Donegal, and he was Mr. Stuart. So Mary Cowan became Mrs. Stuart, and then they made the leap from west to east and purchased in 1744 Mount Stuart. But as part of her kind of wealth, she was an heiress. Her brother,
Robert.
Yes, Robert Cowan, had died without legitimate issue, and I researched Robert. I became fascinated by Mary. And if you look at his will, which is in prony at the minute, he says, to my sister Mary I leave my London townhouse, and St James's I leave my diamonds, which was the now known as the Londonderry diamonds, or the Londonderry Parure, which are mined from the Golconda mine, so that they're some of the most precious jewels in the world.
He was the East India Company.
Yes, he was governor of Bombay.
Wow.
And was a really interesting character because he could speak the sort of native languages and communicate and write, and had really the trade, sort of, even that Lady Rose to this day still has segments of fabric from his trips to India, which she can pull out on occasion to impress guests, but yes, Mary, anyway, it was with her money that Mount Stuart was bought.
She's the bedrock from which the whole...
Yes, and she was the first Mary Stuart of Mount Stuart, and I think, interestingly, the last person to own Mount Stuart was Lady Rose's mum, another Mary Stuart. So it began the Mary Stuart and ended with the Mary Stuart. But yeah, so those diamonds, they're on display at the moment in the V&A Museum in London.
And his will specifically said you have to buy a country house with this.
Yes,
this money.
So she was following instructions. So
he wanted a legacy, didn't he?
Yeah, well, see, I think whenever he died, he was genuinely searching for an estate in England, and he had his house in London, and he was he I think he was a bit of a dissolute young man who maybe liked the drink and various other things. And interestingly, I do think he had an Indian daughter, because in his will, in Brody, he says, "To my sister I leave, blah blah blah. To my daughter I leave a sum of money, but someone scored out daughter, and on top, this is a very expensive will, hand calligraphied on, vellum, and someone laterally has scored out daughter and put goddaughter on top in rough writing.
What was her name?
I don't know, but I don't know whether it's actually listed, but I can't remember. But I do know I brought this to Lady Rose, and she said actually she was fairly certain there was a painting of his daughter somewhere in the collection at Mount Stewart, but we never really got that far.
Did she ever inherit anything?
She inherited some money, yes. So she did inherit. He did provide for her. And this is my feeling, but I just don't understand why. Obviously, if she was an illegitimate daughter, she would not have inherited anyway, because people can only inherit, especially in the upper classes, if you are a legitimate heir, conceived within marriage.
That's so interesting, because this project, Historic Houses Global Crossroads, is all about globalising Mount Stewart, but it sounds like it was global from dot, from the very first purchase moment.
Oh yeah,
it was always a crossroads of empire.
Yes, it was a complete. The only reason Mount Stewart exists as we know it today, and the only reason why it was bought, at the time it was by the Stuarts or by Mary Cowan, was because her brother had such a successful career in India.
And he'd squirreled money over, hadn't he, under that wasn't taxed and so on.
Yeah, and actually I think he was, I don't know, maybe not, always doing things by the book, but he certainly did very well out of it. And I actually, I think even, Mount Stewart exists because of that. Their townhouse in London, I think actually the last Lady Mary, who didn't die until fairly recently, I think she actually had still owned that house. So that was a Cowan house as well in St James's Square. And I think she still had the lease to that, or the freehold.
So when you look back at your curatorship of Mount Stewart, how do you think that you moved the dial of representation or people's understanding of Mount? Because, Mount Stewart was seen as very much the seat of unionism and as a very uncomplex seat of empire. Did you shift that dial and make it a more nuanced space?
Yes, well, I suppose the thing is that, we can't judge these people by today's values and how we feel about certain things today. And I'm sure if they lived today, they probably would have different perspectives, so, whenever Edith was lobbying for, votes for women, she said, all women must have the vote, but she also, something I never really advertised, but something she also said was, if they are, landowners or property owners and Protestant, so so she was a product of her time and her background.
So you can be free if you're a Protestant.
But I think if I take a sort of my view on her at the moment, I see a woman who was incredibly for her time, incredibly liberal. She was, doing fantastic things that we all identify with, even me. She loved her tattoos. So she was getting covered in tattoos, and she was, friend. She had quite a sort of a wide sphere of friends who would have veered onto my kind of queer side of the spectrum, so...
I wanted to ask you, what does it mean to have a serpent tattooed up your inner thigh in the 20s? I mean, what and I know what it means now, I think. Well, I don't, but I have an idea. But what does it mean then, to do something? Surely that was wild, truly wild.
Yeah, I suppose it would have been wild, yeah. I think... and she certainly had more than the serpent, because I've seen photographs of her with, sort of family shields and various different things emblazoned on her thighs and on her legs and stuff. So, so she, she didn't just have one. She was, you know, many ways covered, as was her husband. So, the tattoo ship thing was a joint endeavour. Lord Londonderry was a great lover of tattoos as well. So
that would have been quite unusual, no?
Yeah, well, I suppose, I think it was always something that was kept under clothes, I suppose, because I think she went out once and somebody caught a glimpse of her leg and, and they said, oh, Lady Londonderry is sporting patterned stockings. So it was never something that was meant to be shown to the kind of middle classes, I suppose, or the lower orders,
Yes.
of which she presided over. But, I think probably quite racy, for the time. But, I think whenever you think about, what they were doing, I think you can't judge them, by middle class values today or whatever. I think, one of the things I did at Mount Stewart was I brought, drag to Mount Stewart, so
again, brought it there again, maybe, I suppose.
brought it there again, because we wanted to engage in a different way and wider audiences and that kind of thing, and something I had done in my previous kind of more like charitable work, was to have these kind of murder mystery evenings and stuff to get people into these houses at night time, where we could have alcohol, we could have food, we could have fun, and everyone could dress up. And so I always took the lead and dressed up as, a Russian princess, or, I dressed up as Edith's friend, the American Laura Corrigan, who was, gave Edith Londonderry this fabulous emerald bracelet.
She was truly wild, wasn't she?
Yes.
I mean, really,
yeah.
God almighty.
But you look at those photographs of what they were doing then, and they were literally, it was literally men dressed as women, women dressed as men, and just having so much fun and really, pushing the boundaries as we would see it today. But and I think, there was great concern about me doing that sort of thing at Mount Stewart because of, obviously, Mount Stewart, I suppose, it's run by the National Trust, which is a members' organisation, so you have to be quite careful about the sort of things you do. But Lady Rose, again, is probably the best litmus test of what's right for Mount Stewart. She said, my grandmother was doing this long before he ever was, so what's the problem? Everyone loves Edith, so what's the problem?
This is the irony about the kind of tea and scones and gift shop reality of the National Trust, that it can hide that very raucous, transgressive past. It kind of deadens it all in a way.
Well, I think mainstream history is exclusive, and I as a queer man, I've often thought how wonderful it would have been to have seen myself represented in these properties, because as a young man obsessed with history, I never really got to see myself reflected in the narratives which were told in these places, nor in the collection which was shown to the public. And bear in mind, what people see in these showrooms, in these houses, have been edited. So we only see what curators put out, and there's storerooms filled with stuff. And we're only fed the narratives that were, which are tested and
which the historic family are
happy with. See, yes. So I suppose, I sort of felt with Mount Stewart there was always, with Edith, she had these wonderful things which were so playful, sort of almost childish, like the Ark, her social club, from Winston Churchill to, Nancy Astor,
Ramsay
MacDonald, and which are so immortalised now in the gardens at Mount Stewart. She had this arc where she wanted two of everything, and everyone was welcome in her arc.
It's a metaphysical club, basically, the arc.
Yeah. So, which was created during the First World War. It was informal until then. if you wanted to dine with her, it would have been under, white tie and tails and diamonds. But during this period, she sort of invented the kind of supper club. And so whenever I was curator at Mount Stewart, if we had an event, it was always a supper club because
Were they still wearing whalebone corsets and all that stuff? Was that all totally gone by then, or?
No. I think certainly, certainly whenever the First World War was, or just prior to that, they still would have been incredibly constrictive clothing, and she still would have been wearing full length, gowns with corsets and everything else. So for her to, I suppose, be conscious of the war and what was going on, and the fact that she was setting up her Women's Legion, and that people didn't have time for all this stuff to get dressed and to change and to do all that kind of stuff, but people could still come together and exchange ideas and talk and think and converse or whatever. I think that was quite inclusive for the time, and I think we could learn a lot from that, and her inclusivity, regardless of political opinion and that sort of thing. I think the good thing about Edith too was that she was enough of a realist that she said, in her own words, she said she knew in her life as a woman she had to be insidious, and she used the term insidious,
Meaning?
That she could never be clear about what she wanted to say. She always had to construct cleverly what she wanted to say, or charm or maneuver people in the right direction to get the outcome that she required. And I think whenever you think about Charlie's political career, or even courting the politicians of the day to be influenced to do certain things, or to behave in a certain way, or to advocate for certain things, I think she knew that her alter ego of Cersei, that everyone called her Cersei, that she was, that she had to be an enchantress. She got what she wanted by enchanting.
And what did she want at core? I mean, she's a unionist, right?
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah.
And so what she wants is Northern Ireland to stay in union with Great Britain.
Oh yeah, completely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think before that, her mother-in-law was obviously president of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council, and probably one of the most vehement. Teresa, one of the most vehement Ulster Unionists that probably ever was. But before that, obviously Viceroy of Ireland. So she didn't see Ulster. She didn't see Northern Ireland. She didn't see Ulster. She saw Ireland. She was, so she she had a great Irish ancestry herself, Teresa. So she saw Ireland as a jewel in the crown of the British Empire. She didn't, and that's what she advocated for strongly. And I suppose, yes, from Castlereagh, this act of union, and they are very strongly Ulster Unionist and conservative, but not to the exclusion of other viewpoints. And I think Daisy, the Countess of Fingal, writes very clearly on that she was, from Galway. She was a Catholic, and yet she said, she was never, she said, I don't know what Teresa or the rest of them thought of me, but I was never excluded from their parties or their, their world. She was very much welcome to Mount Stewart and sat in the drawing rooms of Mount Stewart, as with, Ramsay MacDonald.
Well, yeah, it's such a Catholic world in the sense of accepting of many ways of being.
Yeah.
And he was Catholic in that sense that he had no problem with being intimate with the nobility, even though he was working class. I mean, all these simple binaries that we set up now
Yes.
didn't necessarily apply, from queer straight to work class versus socialist versus conservative
Yeah.
versus Whig. All of this didn't really, it doesn't translate the way we look at it now, the
Yeah.
way it was then.
I think, Lady Rose, you know, Lady Londonderry's granddaughter, always explained it very well to me whenever she said that, if you look at someone like Edith or Therese or whoever, but, certainly Edith's more within memory for her, that they love people. It didn't matter whether you were rich, poor, Catholic, Protestant, lefty, righty, whatever. It really didn't matter as long as you had a commonality. So Edith was very friendly with a young man called Duncan Morrison, who was a composer from the Hebrides, and their sort of Scottish ancestry. His father was a crofter, I think, but they met somehow. Edith became his patroness and got a lot of his music commissioned. And he was such a part of their life that Lady Rose today still recounts how she remembers wee Duncan sitting in the drawing room making potpourri with her mummy and
I found some of Edith's potpourri today. It was so weird in a red kind of pepper pot. And you
yes.
smelt it, and it was this like literally smelling the past. It was weird, the
Yeah.
weirdest thing ever.
Yeah. And again, I think Edith, talking about being insidious, she was. I know insidious is a horrible word, but she used it, not me. Everything was a symbol. You sort of think, even her women's suffrage. She had the sort of emblem for the Women's Legion. But she supplemented that with the rose. And the rose didn't mean England. The rose meant votes for women for her.
Oh, really?
So if you walk around the garden at Whitechurch, you'll see, imprinted in concrete or carved in stone roses. That's her referring back to her work in the Women's Legion, setting up the army that would do kind of the men's work during the First World War. And again, to me, it sort of says equality, or votes for women. And if you look at the potpourri box, it was probably stamped with a rose, usually, and then, she would give them out as gifts, or she would sell them for the war effort. And that's why, that's where they came from. That's why she started packaging them up to sell them for the war effort. And then, if you were staying there, you would get some of her potpourri, always marigold, roses, lavender, rose hip, always topped with a sprig of delphinium, and with all her different oils. If people go to Whitechurch today, they can still see her potpourri room where she mixed the potpourri with all her bits and pieces and her apron and everything, all still there. But that her butter was stamped always with either a rose or the Women's Legion stamp. So if you sat down to dinner, she was, everything was very contrived and thought out, and there's Women's Legion's symbols all over the garden. So she was very good at symbolism. Really good at symbolism.
So just to go back to Castlereagh, how do you see Castlereagh's legacy, or do you have any thoughts on that?
I actually, whenever I began at Mainstream, I didn't actually think very much about Castlereagh, to be honest. He, was sort of this ever-present figure, but kind of he wasn't sort of reading as strongly as Edith at that point. Mainstream had really become Edith's 1920s pleasure palace. And that was the narrative.
He does create 100 years of peace in Europe.
He's
not a slacker.
And I think actually, if you understand Edith properly, you understand Castlereagh. And if you understand Castlereagh, you similarly appreciate what Edith was trying to do more. And I've always wanted to write a book about Edith as interior designer and mistress of collections, because whenever you look at, Castlereagh, as you say, he went off, he played such a central role at the Congress of Vienna. His brother fought against Napoleon, and they came away from that negotiating 100 years of peace in Europe, largely, with all of these artifacts, all of this collection, so papal candlesticks, Congress of Vienna desk,
the chairs,
the Congress chairs. But who was it that made them such an integral part of the furniture at Mount Stuart? It was Edith. Edith came along, and I think she whenever she married into the family, it was roughly, certainly whenever she became Lady Londonderry or Marchioness of Londonderry, it was roughly 100 years since the Congress of Vienna. And whenever she took over Mount Stuart, I think everywhere you look, it's an ode to Castlereagh. This Castlereagh portraits, Castlereagh desk, the Congress of Vienna chairs. She is constantly pushing that narrative, and I don't know whether I'm correct, but I always thought, she was a political hostess at a time of great change. She saw Ireland changing. She saw the formation of Northern Ireland, and she wanted her husband to be a part of both, the kind of British administration, but also play a prominent role in Ulster. And I wonder, was she sort of emulating this diplomatic, Castlereagh-esque, persona for her and her husband to go, we are the Londonderrys, we are the best at this, we play a leading role at this.
Well, this has always been the kind of the best take you can put on the aristocracy and indeed the monarchy, that they cultivate peace and convene peace and are the diplomats par excellence. That's the nicest spin you can put on the whole thing.
Yes.
Do you see Castlereagh as part of queer history?
Absolutely, yes. And I think the thing is, with queer history, a bit like women's history, it can be dismissed incredibly quickly, especially by people in mainstream history, as I know to my,
I don't think Kissinger mentions it in his book.
Well, yeah, and I think going back to my women's history, until fairly recently, fairly notable historian said, I don't write about women of the big house very much because quite simply they don't feature very much, which is absolutely ridiculous. And people say, and I've talked about queer histories and national trust properties, before, and of course you're always rebutted with a kind of, well, how are you going to prove it? And I sort of feel like saying, well, how are you going to prove that they were straight? Castlereagh had no children, so how do we know that he consummated his marriage? How do we know she wasn't a big fag hag? So if we're going to go down that route, how do we prove it? And if, even if you do find love letters or that kind of thing, they sort of go, oh, you're putting a 21st century spin on love between two males or two females or whatever. You're going, well, you're putting a middle class heteronormative spin on the very same letters. So, let's have a bit of discourse, let's have a bit of energy here, and let's have a bit of open-mindedness, So I think with Castlereagh, I think he's wonderful because of his political history, but also I think in the history of disability, mental illness, because obviously he committed suicide, and also sexuality, because again it was said that he was caught with a man in his room or whatever, and him and many more like them, and I think there's historians coming up, like I absolutely love Dr. Anthony Delaney at the minute. He's written about queer Georgians, and he's really sort of showing, actually, come on, why do we think that gayness is new? Why do we think homosexuality is new? Like, come on. And even I think, using a sort of lens, like, a queer lens, I remember, I have to say, I completely pay tribute to my partner, Chris, whose PhD is in queer history. Because whenever I first met him, I'm of such a vintage that he's younger than me. He's my toy boy. But, whenever he used the word queer, I was completely offended, and I really hated the word. And what he has shown me through the word queer is a world of possibility that I never thought existed, and an open-mindedness that I never thought existed. And so whenever I think of Mount Stewart, not even Castlereagh, but I think of Mount Stewart and its inclusivity and in the fusion of things that perhaps naturally shouldn't go together, but which do go together, both in the garden and in the interiors. And the contrasts, if you view Mount Stewart through a queer lens, oh my goodness, you've got a world of endless possibility.
Both houses actually, Clandeboy as well.
Yeah.
It depends what lens you apply.
Yeah.
So, just in conclusion, is there any? I mean, we haven't touched on the elephant in the room here, which is the garden.
Yes, and I think the garden. I think again, the garden in many ways to me. I always find the garden incredibly hard to understand because it doesn't sit within an Irish context. And my love, if we go back to Wee Boy and Tyrone, my love was the Irish country house, which by that stage was usually fairly forlorn, walled gardens, long grass, Elizabeth Bowen, or not Elizabeth Bowen, Edith Somerville, writes very keenly about kind of the pothole driveways, the cow dung on the driveway, the sheep in the fields, or the gardens, the remnants of what would have been but lost. Whereas Mount Stewart, really sticks out as this, hugely contrived, hugely expensive, hugely international, and
my God, the money.
Yeah.
I mean, she was just opening a vein for that garden.
Yeah.
Importing peat from England, bringing peat to Ireland. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
And the most expensive rhododendrons and God knows what.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just spent the day going through her gardening papers at her desk.
Yeah.
And it's just ridiculous.
Yeah. So I think it took me a very long time to grasp what she was trying to do. And I think it didn't sit well with me. It's sort of, even if you live at Mount Stewart, even as a member of staff, you sort of look out through the window one day and there's like a huge tree there, or some bush, and then you go to bed, waking up the next day and it's gone. It's sort of this continuous rotation of plants going to hothouses and being dumped in for a second, and then
she was doing that.
She was doing that too. And, everything they do today is based on what she really wanted. So actually, what she's doing in many ways, it's not Irish at all. It's not.
There's nothing indigenous. Well, there's only 16 or so trees that are indigenous anyway.
Yeah, but I think similarly with the interior, I always find it quite difficult to understand the interior because again, it was only whenever it dawned on me that this is an international interior, it's not an Irish interior, that I went, oh. But it took me, I'm obviously very slow, but it took me a very long time to get there and to think. And I think it was actually Lady Rose again who kind of prompted me, and said, you're trying to squeeze Mount Stewart into what you know about, the kind of literature or whatever of the historiography of the Irish country house, but we are different. Mount Stewart is different because they have such a global presence.
So is it a bit like going to the cinema and you're always in America buying popcorn? Is it like when you're in Mount Stewart you're in this global space? Is that what you're saying? Or
yeah, and I think I think with the gardens again you're playing with the fact that this woman travelled. And she went to
India, Andalusia.
Yeah. She went to India to recover her pleurisy pain, or from her pleurisy pains, and fell in love with India and all its plantings and its architecture and its ceramics and everything else. Similarly with Spain, she went and hung out with her friend King Alfonso, fell in love with all of the gardens there. She went to Italy. She was completely inspired by the gardens at the Pitti Palace, the Boboli Gardens, but also with the gardens at the Palazzo Farnese, and more and more and more and more. And she was almost kind of taking these snapshots of this global, all these places, and going, well, I'll have my Vernese-inspired, balustrade. I'll have my, Spanish-inspired colonnades of trees. I will have, X, Y, and Z. And so,
but they're hybrid spaces. They're anglicised.
Yes.
When I was looking at some of them and thinking, she takes a plant that she likes that's trailing around a banyan tree in India.
Yeah.
But it's in a space of empire, and then she transports it to. What is she doing in these rooms she creates in this amazing garden?
I think she's creating her legacy, and it perhaps was not meant to be understood. It was meant to enchant. It was meant to be whimsical. It was meant to be everything that she brought together as Circe and fused together. And I think almost sometimes if you try and make sense of it, you're ruining it for yourself. And she was a great sponsor of Frank Kingdom Ward, the plant hunter. She funded many of his expeditions, was a key funder, because she would say, "I want rhododendrons, go and get me some." Go to Burma, go wherever you need to go to get what I want. Get me some Himalayan lilies, whatever. But interestingly, in his book, which was published in the 1930s, I think it's called The Romance of Gardening, but he almost, I sort of feel you're getting a sense of what Edith was doing, because he asked the question at the start of the book, what is an English garden? And he said there's no such thing as an English garden. Most old English gardens are Dutch inspired, and they move on like that. And he said that a lot of gardens, a lot of the best gardens are actually playful gardens, childish gardens, whimsical gardens, mythological gardens, or inspired gardens. And then he sort of talks you through this sort of idea of walking through a garden. And I swear it's like walking from the French doors of the saloon at Mount Stuart to the Domain lands. He walks you through these different, Spanish gardens, Italian gardens, and then you walk through all of the symbolism, and then you penetrate a boundary, or you walk through a hedge, and then you see a wilderness beyond, and that sort of thing.
The third remove,
Yeah,
the wild.
And I think it's so, what she was trying to do, is probably encapsulated too in her, children's book, The Magic Ink Pot, where she uses Mount Stuart and the surrounding area, Strangford Lough, as the kind of, habitat for her, for this world. But, it's filled with witches and goblins and fairies and, sea mermen, and her children riding the horses of these sort of sea creatures, or the backs of these sea creatures. So everything, I sort of feel like Mount Stuart is probably seen at its best through an enchanted infantile eye, because it is so complex and so, it's so complex and so layered that I think if you try to understand it in that sense, you completely lose the fun of it.
But is it fun? I mean, from one fairly radical left-leaning point of view, you could say this is the seat of empire in the north, and she's creating a form of indigeneity for herself and a fantasy symbolic world, because outside the garden it's dangerous, and it's contested, and she's not welcome for some. So is she creating security inside the walls of the garden because outside is choppy?
Gosh, yeah, I suppose. I don't know. I think that narrative is probably played out in kind of the literature and the kind of history books as we kind of know them.
Mm.
But yeah, that's a good question.
I
That's a
don't
good
know
question.
either. I was hoping you'd have some.
You know, I think she was incredibly. I think Edith, in my opinion, she was incredibly. You know, well, her grandson, I suppose, called her terrifying, didn't he?
Did he? Because I'm slightly in love with her. I think you are too.
Yeah, no, I am too. But I think.
What was
I,
scary? What was so scary about her?
I think her personality was so overwhelming that he said, Alistair Londonderry said that he said that she was terrifying, and he said she referred to Stanley Baldwin as that horrible little man. You know, and if she didn't, you know, well, she always got what she wanted, but you know, I think that came with very power and privilege, you know, and money.
Explain to me this. So she had a husband who was well after everything, really, in a skirt type of thing,
Yeah.
and yet she had this serene, totally forgiving approach to him. Did she kill him with kindness, as it were, or what? What?
Um,
How can such a formidable personality put up with a husband who's?
I think I think Edith was genuinely, absolutely besotted with Charles, and
Mm.
I think she thought he was gorgeous, sexy as hell, and you know, and I think the thing is, in any aristocratic marriage, you know, infidelity was just part and parcel of what went on. You know, I don't think you know, it wasn't. There was no sort of middle class kind of, oh no, we can't put our keys in the bowl because you know that's going to end in divorce. I think you know it was very much, um, you know, she knew that Charles had a strong sex drive and that he was going to go after people or whatever. And it was, you know, it was almost kind of something that wasn't a big deal as long as it wasn't kind of threatening to her position.
Mm.
Um, you know, and I think in many ways, you know, Charles, she was a much stronger character. You you know, he does seem to me, to have been a slightly weaker character than she was. You know, in terms of his intelligence and his political ability.
But he did see combat, right? So you know.
Yeah, yeah, he did. But you know, I think again he complained that he didn't actually you know get out to the you know the front. You know, he was kind of he didn't you know he wanted to go out and fight, but he was kind of almost held back and protected a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think he was very much strongly a victim of his circumstances. You know, he grew up with his idol of Castlereagh, and that he was Viscount Castlereagh, and that he was Marquis of Londonderry. How do you live up to that? You know, and in the 20th century, you know, I think that wonderful book, The Remains of the Day, puts it very beautifully, which I believe actually some people say was based on Lord Londonderry. Um, you know, that the world had changed and politics was different, and no longer can the world be carved up and decided upon by a pile of well-meaning amateurs. You know, so I think he was actually quite a tragic figure in the end because he was brought up with a sense of public duty and you know he was doing great things like trying to espouse integrated education in Northern Ireland from the 1920s, and nobody would listen to him, and you know, really threw himself into his Air Force work and, you know, being Minister for Air and learning how to fly at a much older age and everything else. And yet, the world was so unkind to him because it was the 20th century. And whilst, you know, his the world in which he grew up to, you know, be the leader of or be a speaker for was vanishing. You know,
And
so
and yet, in ways, we're coming back round to that, carving the world up in a multipolar world again. We're coming back to that great power. The European dream is not what it was. It seems like it's been 100 years, and we're coming back to.
Yeah, coming back around again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I do think he's a bit of a tragic figure in a way, and I think Edith, whenever he got fed up with his women, she was often the person who had to get rid of them, so he would send her out to say, Lord Londonderry is no longer interested. Next, um,
Should we speak of, in conclusion, or maybe we shouldn't, about the whole Nazi thing, and how do you read that?
Yeah, I think it's very simple. I think the the aristocracy at that time, and again, I don't judge them from a 21st century viewpoint or from my different background and all that kind of stuff. But they were the aristocracy. They did have a privileged upbringing and a privileged perspective on the world, and I think they genuinely looked at Germany and thought, gosh, things are going well there after being so persecuted after the First World War. Look at what they're managing to achieve. And I think they were sort of going, oh gosh, is this a great sense of modernity, and is this a great sense and again under a right-wing prism, so this is all very acceptable. And I think, again, to go back to the remains of the day, they thought by going off and through this gentlemanly diplomacy that they could be part of this and influence and all the rest, and of course then history would sort of bite them literally in the arse for even entertaining such an idea, because there's all those doubts about did people know about what they were doing, and did they know about the Jews being persecuted, how much were they aware of, or how much was concealed. But to me, I don't think it's any great surprise that they would be in some way. I think it was one of the Mitford sisters who said, everyone's very kind of, in hindsight, everyone sort of is very, anti-Hitler, but anybody who becomes so successful so quickly must have some ability to, there must be some cult of the personality there, there must be something that entices people to, he's obviously got rhetoric, or he's got charm, or he's got something. So, she was saying, yeah, it was awful, and we all know that now, but at the time, how could they have known that? And again, if they were well-meaning amateurs, did they think that a gentlemanly handshake was going to, be okay, and that was going to be enough? So were they maybe a little infantile in thinking that that's the way the world was working, and that's what was happening? So, I think, and I also think as well, with Hitler and Germany, with regards to Lord Londonderry, I really did think that he thought that this was his opportunity to be the next Castlereagh.
His Castlereagh moment, yeah.
And unfortunately that didn't come, So again, I do feel, a sense of, sadness for Lord Londonderry, that he was probably hoping that just as a person within that family, within that sphere, within that world, that he would finally play his part.
So looking at it now and looking at future generations, it's a new century. There's new generations of kids now, thank God, in Northern Ireland that haven't grown up with the Troubles, that aren't approaching either the National Trust or historic houses in the same way as maybe we were encouraged to, or you were encouraged to. So how would you encourage people to look at Mount Stuart in the 21st century and the upcoming generations? And you stressed nuance. You talked about layers of an onion. I think that's a really good metaphor for it. how do people get beyond the kind of national trust, received heritage way of looking at it? How do they find their own Mount Stewart, their own readings? I mean, what's your advice?
I think that we, as a society, and certainly people younger than me, um, need to take ownership of these places. We need to own our own history and ensure that our own history is being exhibited by the people who, at the moment, hold the keys, hold the power. So I think, we have a voice. We all, I think whenever I was a curator within the trust, I always hoped that a young new Neil would walk in through the doors and through one of my exhibits or through something that I had shown or put on display, that they would see an element of themselves, and I think I've shown that that is possible. I've worked with women who have been through the judicial system. I've brought them to Mount Stewart. They have felt so connected, and oftentimes it was a tattoo which connected them to Lady Londonderry, where she became not Lady Londonderry but our Edith, in our Northern Ireland, sense. So I sort of feel like whether it's any great organisation, they don't own history. History is there for all of us.
Here, here.
To be investigated and to be enjoyed and to be placed under the spotlight. And I think it would be incredibly dangerous for the world, especially the political climate we're in at the minute, to constrict narratives to what's palatable, to what might appeal to membership goers, or what might appeal to the kind of masses, because something which history has shown us is that we must be mindful of equity. It must be equitable, and people must, yes, we can have, talk about mainstream history, but, what happens if we forget about, the women's history, the queer history? What if we don't learn? What if we don't, what if we, cut all that back? So,
I think another thing too is not to condescend to the past and be inverted snobs towards the rich. They're interesting. I don't think we should write them off just because of what they're born into. In the same way, we shouldn't write off the people in the fields. And
also, I can remember somebody, a very wise person, once telling me, "We are the people we've been waiting for." So that they're dead. They're gone. But what you can do is, have an open mind and learn from the past. And actually, in my experience as, a fairly amateur historian, is that there is nothing stranger and more open-minded and more exciting than fact. History is so nuanced. And if you actually deign to delve into the archives, or to, as you say, have an open mind, because oftentimes if we don't go into a stately home, it's on us. I may think, oh, I'm not good enough to go in there. However, if I go in there, if I go beyond that barrier, whatever, I might actually find something really meaningful that means something, to me, and will transcend, my beliefs and everything else. So
I think on that brilliant note, we should probably, we've been talking for so long and it's been so brilliant. I think we could talk forever. Do you want to have a last word, a comment, or a thought you want to leave folk with?
Oh gosh. I suppose, I think that the Irish country house, especially places like Mount Stewart, but a lot of other houses as well, have so much to offer in a new Ireland. And as you say, they shouldn't be these sort of exclusive places, because that world is dead, that world is gone. Um, and ultimately, in a place like the National Trust, essentially the national interest should be foremost. So, the historic collections, the cultural heritage, the history, everything belongs to us. It belongs to the people, and we should take pride in that. If I often said, as a curator and as that farmer's son, I was incredibly proud and privileged to look after statuary by Antonio Canova, to preserve and protect and conserve paintings by Sir Thomas Lawrence, and to have all of this in Northern Ireland, and to even sort of see how, in Northern Ireland we can often, we often put ourselves down quite a bit. We sort of go, we're only from Northern Ireland, we're only Northern Ireland. I know I do it.
Speak for yourself.
I always do it, and it's a curse, and then you look at somewhere like Mount Stewart and you go, well, look at how this place is so symbolic of international politics and international diplomacy, and how the interiors, the garden, whatever, is so influenced by this sense of the international, and how even Castlereagh, as a young man from Ireland, played such a central role in the world stage. That's good for us to remember too, because that's our shared history. And I suppose with Mount Stewart, I always sort of say that the one thing it taught me is that, and it is a sort of mantra of Lady Londonderry, that the impossible is always possible. And I think if you believe that from any walk of life, that you really can manifest it. And I think, it's very, very good words for everybody's future. Keep dreaming of the impossible.